internationally to celebrate, May Day, of course, being an important day for labor internationally. So I think we need to wrestle with that. Why don't we celebrate that time? And it is because of American fears and allergies to any talk of socialism or communism, which I hope you all know are very different. But this sort of fear of communism has deeply rooted in American society. And we had our own Red Scare, where people were literally thrown into jail for having the wrong views about economics and about society. That was in my parents' lifetime. So that's not that long ago that we were throwing people in jail for making movies that seemed to be, have a communist message and other things. It wasn't just Hollywood, And so that fear is deeply rooted with us. And it came after a time when we almost elected a socialist president for the very first time, Eugene Debs, back in the 1920s. Who you should go back and listen to some speeches from Eugene Debs. They're fantastic. They're very interesting. So there was a time when socialism was much more widely believed and much more widely accepted, and it was tied to the rights of workers, and it was tied to building an equitable society for all people. This is the struggle that we're in right now, is that there's such a lack of attention to history that it's easy for people to be fooled by whatever media source they're listening to, and it could be CNN or Fox News. I just read an article about how CNN is the new Fox News. So they're coming for all the media at some point. And we're not going to be able to have reliable sources of information from television media soon. But one of the things we can't do as average Americans is distinguish between propaganda and truth. And so because of that, we accept the views of history provided to us by television pundits who are saying, well, we've never been a country of socialism. That's completely untrue. We've never had communism of any, completely untrue. We've always been about free market capitalism, and that what we have today is exactly the same as the free market capitalism of the past. It's completely untrue. We have a very specific neoliberal form of capitalism today that came about in the 70s and 80s. It's brand new. It's a brand new form of capitalism, and it is eroding democracy. We're at a point now where our economic system and our political system, and those are different, are eating each other. One is eating the other alive. And capitalism is going to devour democracy if something is not done. There's a number of great books on this that you can read. Democracy in Chains by Nancy McLean is a very helpful one that shows that Americans didn't just believe in democracy as such, but the two tenets of democracy, which were freedom and equality. But if you only believe in freedom, then it can be freedom for not just individuals, but freedom for corporations and freedom for billionaires and freedom to do whatever you want with your money and not have to pay taxes. Whereas if you also hold the tenet of equality as sacred as the tenet of freedom, you can balance out freedom with the pursuit of equality. And that's how you make a democracy, is with both equality and with freedom for everybody, right? But if you only have freedom, then you can advance free market capitalism in the name of freedom, and it can eat away at equality over and over and over again. That's why we are now, where we are the most unequal we've ever been in American history, and that's because CEOs are making 300 times what the average worker is making. It's because corporations are not paying taxes. And there's I don't know if you know this about the recent bill that was passed. That was the first real environmental bill ever passed. What do they call that? It was the inflation thing. It was the Inflation Act, right? They had to name it for inflation to get it passed. It was a watered down version of Build Back Better, right? Anyway, at the very end, they almost did not get it passed because of Kyrsten Sinema, who was holding back from approving it because of a loophole in the tax law that she and the people that fund her wanted to make sure did not get overturned, which makes it it's very complicated, but you can listen. There's a great daily on this. I can't remember exactly what the name of this tax is, but basically it's a loophole that allows people who are trading money to not pay taxes on a large portion of traded money. And so she came in at the last minute and said, if you try to overturn this, I'm not voting. So it was left in. So the loophole still happening? Carried interest. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen Taylor. Carried interest. Yeah, carried interest is about as un-American as anything I've ever seen. And Americans have been trying to get rid of carried interest for many years. And every time they propose it to try to get a whole group of people, of course, the financial services industry goes after people like crazy. They pay lobbyists, they get politicians, and they make sure that carried interest is maintained. And we can debate the arguments of whether carried interest should be a thing or not. But anyway, it's a tax loophole. And it helps wealthy people get more wealthy. I can't use carried interest, but they can. And so I think it's one of those things where we have to look at what are the laws being created, and are they created for the purpose of both freedom and equality, or are they just for freedom in a way that is eroding at our equality? And I think the evidence of where we are now in our society is related to that.
I mean, as soon as you said the role of capitalism changed in the 70s and 80s, I immediately thought back to my childhood and how pretty much the only thing that was open on a Sunday were restaurants. And that was it. I mean, I was an overprogrammed kid. I had no ball practice, no birthday parties. Sunday was church in the morning, Sunday lunch, church at night.
Yeah,
and that
absolutely.
was it.
A lot of people grew up that way.
And so when I talk to, so I have to remind myself of that when I engage with people who say, well, where are the families, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, it's just different.
It's why it's so frustrating to me that no one wants to talk about the relationship of capitalism to church decline.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, why don't you think people are here on Sunday? It's not because they all just became irreligious. America's more religious than it ever has been. They're just too busy.
Yep, that's true. Okay, so we're just going to stay with you, Karen.
Uh-oh.
Doesn't the fact that our American culture, being one of individualist focus make this so much worse? It's your fault if you can't make it, which you sort of referenced a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Japan, another capitalist country, is more of a collective society, but they also toil as workers and without complaint, but with shame as well. So what does this mean to Christianity? So what does this mean to our Christianity's view of capitalism? Did I get all that right, Karen? Okay.
Yes. Our particular view is lost any sense of the commons or the collective. And if there was a sense, it would make the version of capitalism we have less cannibalistic and violent toward the average worker. But part of what came in the 70s and 80s with neoliberalism was a doubled down form of American individualism. And you started to hear more talk of personal responsibility than ever before in American history. In the war period, it was like, what can we do together to fight the Nazis? How can we all sacrifice together? How can we all, pinch a little bit and buy war bonds so we can make sure that we can fight against the Nazis? How can we get it all together? There was a sense of the common good and that we were all striving for the same goal. Now, there were people who were outside of that common good that were because of their race or immigration status, but there was at least some sense of the collective. It was probably like a white collectivity, but there was some sense of that. But post-war period, particularly after the Civil Rights Movement, there was a wild reaction to that. And it was, again, sort of doubling down on individualism, but individualism in a way that was like, it's all up to you, and the American dream is up to you. You got to work hard. That's why I love the lyrics from the Billy Joel song, where he talks about, the promises our teachers made. If we worked hard, if we behaved, right? That every one of us would have a shot to get just as much as our parents got, right? That was the promise of the American dream, or at least a little bit more, is we all hope that our children will have a little bit more than us. And that was true for every generation up until a particular point. And you can trace the point when that changes with the change in capitalism. And that change in capitalism comes in the 70s and 80s with the advent of neoliberal ideology. And I've talked about this before. It was pioneered in Chile, And even though the authoritarianism that came with the Chilean dictatorship was taken away from neoliberalism to some extent, the economic ideology was continued forward by Reagan and Thatcher and many others. And it was the idea that we disinvest from everything except military and police. We disinvest from education. We disinvest from healthcare. We dismantle the safety net. In order to do what? Cut taxes, right? And the point of that is then that corporations, you've heard trickle down, corporations will then be able to pass this down onto their workers, right? Did that happen? No. Instead, CEOs are now making 300 times more than the average worker because you can't leave it up to the CEOs to be, beneficent to their workers. It's just not human nature. You just can't do that. There are some who will, there are some who won't, and for the most part, people are going to suffer. So I think we have to look back carefully through history and track these changes as they come, and think through what our parents' generation experienced and now what the generation coming after the baby boomers are experiencing. I think about this lot with millennials. They have faced no world in which there was a way to get ahead. And then we want to blame them for being lazy. That's what individualism does, right? Pull yourself up from your bootstraps, millennials. We had it great, but we figured it out. We worked hard. We behaved, We did everything right, and look where we got. As if somehow you can do that now, and it works. It's just not the same. And so now we've added a layer on top of the economic plight that they face themselves in, with almost zero of the advancement, potential for advancement. Now we're going to throw shame on top, because that's what we do as Americans. Here, have a dose of shame on top of your economic situation. So again, that's where the church can come in. First of all, church should be about the elimination of shame. We are not, it's not, and we should be. There's a great book that one of my friends wrote recently that I would highly recommend, and I can send you all a link to get this. It's called It's Not You, It's Everything, which is the opposite of what I heard growing up. It's you. Every one of your problems is you. You made them, you created them. The only way out is for you to do something different. That is a totally non-systems approach, right? Complete personal responsibility. It's totally all about you. He's throwing it on the head. He's saying, no, it's not you, it's everything. You're in a world that is crushing down on you like this. So you've got to think differently from a systems perspective about how to navigate the world when the world has changed. And the old ways of talking about people, just work hard and you'll make it ahead. That way is over. And we got to talk in a new way about what it means to survive and live and thrive in this world.
Well, that reminds me of a post I saw on social media that was written by a woman, and it starts off by saying, I want to apologize right now for everyone who I've ever made appear at an 8 a.m. meeting. Did I tell you about this?
Yeah, I saw that post.
An 8 a.m. meeting, and I will go ahead and admit now that I will never again be able to make an 8 a.m. meeting. And it went on to talk about the challenge of childcare now that her child is in kindergarten, and that the daycare that they specifically chose when she was born used to offer school drop-off. And this year, as her daughter is going into kindergarten, they are no longer offering that. And so the post ends by saying, you can't blame someone for a system that doesn't exist.
Exactly, yeah.
Right?
Where is the child care system for Americans?
Oh, you want to talk about, just in case y'all didn't know, one of the reasons why you saw in the weekly, week after week after week, our need for childcare providers was because we do not have any.
No, shortage.
Significant shortage, and it's not just here. My phone keeps buzzing because my peer learning group, bunch of children's ministers, are all talking about different things. It's everywhere. So I jokingly said one Sunday, when I was really frustrated, I said, we're just going to bring them all in the sanctuary.
Which would be fine.
And we're going to sit them on the chancel steps. We didn't, because some of you stepped up and said, hey, let me step in and let me do something. But this is a real problem. So when you are someone who doesn't make a good wage, what's your motivation to work?
Well,
I mean,
think
it's so challenging. And when we, the collective we, are not saying, man, we need to do something about this.
Yeah. Well, the childcare situation is a reminder of the separate spheres ideology that I try to talk about. It's just the new version of that, which is, yes, women, we want you to work, but we also want you to keep doing childcare. Yeah. So now you got to do everything. Like, do all the childcare that you were doing, and here also do some care for your aging, parents, and over here go to work every day. What? That is crazy. It's brutal, and we've not come up with some kind of system for this. We haven't come up with a financial tax break for people who are providing care for children or adults in their homes. We haven't found any way to make that more humane, which again puts people in a financial burden, and then the shame on top of it, and there seems like there's no way out. And I will say, I see guys doing more, trying to do more, child care, child rearing, parenting, child care, adult care. It's still not enough. Still, most women feel like they got to do everything. And so, that has got to change. It's not a surprise to me that when the COVID workforce dropped, it was mostly women. I don't know if you read those statistics. The dropout, it was mostly women who stopped working, who walked away from their jobs in the Great Resignation. That's to be alarming to all of us. I mean, that's dialing the clock back. And you add that on top of just the attacks coming from the Supreme Court and the right on abortion and other things. It's alarming. It really is alarming. And I think that's why it's really disturbing to me that in the original Build Back Better program, all the social initiatives of infrastructure, all the social infrastructure initiatives were removed in order to get the votes of Manchin and Sinema and others who didn't want their wealthy friends who pay for their campaigns to have to pay the taxes that would then pay for those child care programs. And so the rest of us are left here sitting wondering, wait, what? That was what we really needed. You can build some more roads and you can build some more trains, but if I'm at home with my kid, what do those roads and trains mean for me, right? But so when you take out the social infrastructure, you take the plan and you make it something that it's totally not going to work the way it needed to work. So it's a reminder to us that of the tricky, corrupt political moment that we're in, and everything we can do. The infrastructure plan is great. Every little step we can take is fantastic, but we have got to figure out how to care for families, right? So this may mean that the church, for instance, has to think differently about childcare. Where it used to be we would set up a childcare just to support our members, maybe that's an outreach initiative now. Maybe that's about justice. Have we thought about childcare as justice before? That may be an expansion of our understanding of what social justice looks like. And it's not just race and LGBTQ, it's also economic justice, right?
All right, I'm going to try to get to these last two. Hasn't the work and politics in the public sphere been intertwined since the New Deal in the 30s to defend domestic economic debate? Hasn't the church largely tiptoed around this debate since then by providing some relief for the poor and unemployed, but not speaking out against overpaid CEOs? And something opportunist for different opportunity and limited opportunities for the young and the unskilled.
Yeah. So I love the reference back to the New Deal because a lot of us don't know that history, but there is a particular reason why neoliberalism becomes the predominant economic belief, and that is because the New Deal, in the minds of the corporate tycoons, was an attack on their pocketbooks. And they saw it as socialists. And so there's a great book about this by a guy named Kevin Kruse that I would highly recommend called One Nation Under God, that describes how corporate and industry owners went to church leaders and got them to help them preach against the New Deal. starting as early as the 1940s, with entire conferences that they held and invited pastors from all over the country to come to get talking points on anti-communist rhetoric. It's why you always heard Billy Graham only ever talk politically about communism. He never talked almost ever politically about anything else but that. But he was always going on and on anti-communist, which is really, that's the Christian way to say pro-capitalist. And so pastors were taught for generations to preach against the New Deal, even though the people in their pews were only surviving because of the New Deal, because of the New Deal programs that put them to work, and because of the GI Bill and all these other things that helped to build churches. I mean, churches were not, the heyday of churches came at a time where America was also the most economically affluent, right? And so, these preachers, which interestingly, they actually were, almost cutting themselves down at the knees over time. We look at the church now in relationship to then, but they thought if I have friends with these industry tycoons and these wealthy leaders, that maybe they'll be church leaders and help us financially as a congregation to survive. But the average worker was not helped by these messages. And what it led to was a whole generation of not only preachers, but political leaders aligned with these preachers fighting against the New Deal and trying to roll back the advances of the New Deal and the social safety net and the workers' rights that came with the New Deal politics. And the sort of the apex of that is when neoliberalism becomes the new economic model and completely erodes everything that the New Deal did. That was, and you can actually go back and read and see the conferences and what they theologically taught, and how they taught pastors how to interpret the scriptures in a particular way. And read the parable of the talents like this for your congregation, right? Read all of Luke's parables about money with this slant, for your congregation. And and it was also tied to this sort of like Americanization of the church, which now we can see with white Christian nationalism where that went. But it was, before it was ever the kind of like super patriotism, it was capitalism first. And this is a really powerful book I strongly recommend, One Nation Under God by Kevin Cruz, Princeton scholar. And what you see there is this just attempt by religious leaders funded by corporations to erode New Deal politics and to turn the New Deal into like a communist socialist thing that destroyed our country. That's not what made things hard. What made things hard was the neoliberal advancement afterwards as a reaction to it. The other thing that happened that we have to take, this is totally, you might not even see this as economic, but all of the civil rights advantages that were happening in the 60s also led to neoliberalism. And it also led to mass incarceration. And we have pages and pages written on this now. The reason we had the war on drugs, the war on crime, was to stop protests and to stop civil rights. That's why they invented it. That's why they went after it. Not because crime was worse than ever before, not because drugs were worse than ever before. It was a way to get hippies out of the street and a way to arrest people and throw them into jail forever, lock the key up, and keep them off the streets. And what it, of course, led to, because we live in a racist society, is the arresting of large quantities of black and brown people and putting them in jail, and the creation of mass incarceration, which in many ways supports the neoliberal state, because the prisons are owned. They're privately owned. They're not government owned, right? They're businesses. Prison is a business. And so it advances those things. All that to say, it's dark. There's a darkness under this, and I love that song that Randy sang about the darkness. We have to emerge from this darkness. We cannot, as people who follow Jesus, allow this darkness to cloud our minds and our imaginations so much that we can't grasp towards and envision a new reality that works for everybody, and an economic system where people are going to come together and there's more equality. We can do that. We can build that, but it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of organizing, voting, and a lot of thinking differently about American history, thinking more critically about the history that we're being given.
All right, so this is the last question for this summer season talkback.
Oh, wow. Okay.
There are talkbacks that are lined up. You can read your weekly to see when those are happening. #read it.
But they won't be with me.
But
They'll
they
be
won't.
with guests.
They will be with guests, but you will be present. So you'll have more book. I'll just assume those some more book recommendations. What I was thinking a second ago is you've tossed out at least 4 titles.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm going back to the weekly. I'm going to make a suggestion that we create a "What are we reading" section in the weekly,
That's
so
good.
that y'all don't have
Jeff
to try
and I have been
and
talking about that too.
write
yeah.
them down so fast.
Putting a book list together.
Because if you're me and you're trying to do 4 things at once, there's no time to write things down. Okay, so I just love the way this is from Seth, and Seth, I love the way you do things. It's like written like a paper. Debts is the topic. Then here we get into it. I love it. It's so creative. It's so me.
Well, we know what the topic is at least.
Right. Debts. I love it. Okay. How can people be against student loan forgiveness and still pray that God's will be done on earth, that our debts be forgiven? Many think that if debts are forgiven, that someone else will have to pay for it. Can you elaborate on that? And then he says, thank you, which is so nice.
This
Elaborate
is so fun
and
to
think.
end with debts, and because I think this is the most revolutionary thing about Jesus' life that I've learned in the last 10 years. And that is that he did not mean spiritual debts whenever he talked about debts. And I can make links for you between Luke 4, which I would strongly encourage everyone to read, where Jesus goes to the hometown synagogue and preaches his first sermon and quotes from Isaiah 61 as his mission statement for the world, which is that I came to bring good news to the poor, and then lays out the year of the Lord, which in Jewish prophetic literature was a reference to the year of Jubilee, which was the forgiveness of debts, and it goes all the way back to Leviticus 25. So Jesus took upon himself as his mission for the world the forgiveness of debts, financial debts. We have always interpreted this spiritually, but it is financial debts. So then let me take you to the Lord's Prayer, which I preached on today, where he then says, if you're going to pray, pray like this. Pray for this. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those indebted to us. And you can say, well, Luke says sins, but like I said in the sermon, sin and debt was the same word in almost every ancient language. And I'll come back to that in a second. So then let me take you all the way to how Jesus got killed. He went into the temple, and what did he do? He turned over the tables of who? The money lenders. The money lenders, the creditors, the people lending money in the temple. So I'm just connecting the dots from his mission statement to the Lord's Prayer to how he died. And I'm just going to try to make a quick jump for you. The Pharisees, if you do good study on this, you will come to realize, had made an alignment in first century Judaism with the creditors in society at the time. And they believed that those debts needed to be paid, and they did not believe in Jubilee, and they did not believe in debt forgiveness. So the reason Jesus finds himself in debate with the Pharisees constantly, and in fact at one point calls them lovers of money, right? Doesn't he say that? He calls the Pharisees lovers of money at one point, is because they had a different philosophy than he did about debt. He believed debt should be forgiven. They believed debt should always be enforced, and even if the person is enslaved to debt. And that's the other thing we forget. Today, thank God, you can't give your child or your wife or your spouse as a collateral for your debt. But in that time, and up until the 20th century, there are many places around the world where you would give your loved ones as collateral for your debt to be enslaved, or you yourself would have to work slave wages or slavery to pay off your debts. And most people in the first century society who were the average workers, that's how they were living. Enslaved in debt. Debt peonage is what you call that if you look that up historically. And so when Jesus comes, he sees people living in literal slavery to debt. And he says, no, free them, liberate them. And he uses a biblical practice. He's referencing all the way back to Leviticus 25. And so you might say, that seems pretty radical historically. Had anybody ever said that before? Actually, in fact, many people have said this all throughout Western civilization, going back as far as Hammurabi, that there is a time when we should forgive debts, when a time when debt gets too big, that society can't handle it, and the only way to get the economy back on track again is to forgive debts. And if you read historically about debt, a lot of kings, when they conquered cities or they became king, would forgive everybody's debts at the beginning of their reign as a way to endear the citizens to them and say, you may have had debts under the old empire, but not with me, my loyal subjects. You're going to follow me because I'm going to forgive your debts. Or one thing that they used to do is conquerors would come upon a city and they would say, boop, yep, blow the horn, we're coming in to kill you, but if you turn against your captors, we'll forgive all your debts. And then they would be like, oh yeah, that sounds good. Turn against them, and then very easy to overrun the city. Debt was one of the reasons the economic situation ever changed all throughout history, is that debts would become so big, something had to be done. I think we're headed toward that very same situation. And I think Christians have to think very critically about who are we following when we follow this Savior, this person who came and said, forgive us of our debts. What does it mean for me to have somebody who is in my financial debt as a Christian? Or to be in someone who is a Christian's financial debt? Or to support policies that put people into further debt? And so when it comes to the student loan thing, that to me, when I saw people reacting so strongly to $10,000 of student loan forgiveness, which is not going to help many people, to be honest. The other part of that bill will, actually, which changes some laws and stuff. But anyway, the amount is not going to be that much of a difference in most people's lives because the average student debt is much higher than $10,000, right? It goes back to this idea, you got into this, you should repay it. You made this choice fully knowing what you were doing, did we? We were all told that we had to go to college, that you can't live in this society without going to college, and that college is good debt. Did y'all ever hear that? Good debt. Student loan debt was good debt. That's what I was told. So yeah, let's take some more good debt on. What's the problem with that? And it turns out there's no such thing as good debt, right? Maybe housing debt. I don't know. We'll see. If there's another housing crisis, we won't think that way. But I think we have separated these things out back to the separate spheres, spiritual over here, financial over here. So we don't understand what it means when he says sins and debts, he means the same thing. Because that's what they meant in the first century. There was no spiritual sin over here and then financial debt over here. It was all the same thing. So when he says, I came to forgive sins, or what would you rather me say? I forgive your sins or get up and walk? Or, yes, I have power to forgive sins. My Father gave me the authority to forgive debt. It's radical, right? It's pretty radical, So I think we have to take a step back, get our political and our spiritual Jesus back together again. We've broken them up and separated them. We need to get them back together again and try to figure out what it means to follow this Messiah that led the early church to give up all their possessions and to live of one accord in complete harmony and to have nothing over each other. I mean, that's the thing that's the beloved community vision. I want to end here because I think we're in a community season, rebuilding community. True community in the early church was a community where no one had more economic power than another person in the community. Now that's a revolution. If we could figure out how to do that, everybody would join our church. Everyone would join. If we said, you come here, we'll take care of you forever, financially, and no one will ever have economic power over you ever again. That's a vision. Maybe that'll bring the church people back to church one day,
Well, the first thing I wrote down when you started your sermon was glory of the days before. And some of you know that I get real honed in on this. What day do you want to go to? I'm good with that day.
Yeah.
I can go to those days.
Yeah.
Those sound pretty glorious
First century?
to me. Yeah.
They do sound good, don't they? Yeah.
So, all right, folks, thank you so much for your questions and your laughter and your presence. Next Sunday is Welcome Sunday, formerly known as Startup, but we realize that doesn't always mean anything to people. So Welcome Sunday, we will indeed break bread together and laugh and share stories and talk. So
That'd be good. Thank you all for a great summer of talk back. Great questions this summer. Thank you.